I would like to welcome you to the 9th Karachi Literature Festival. This session will launch the book titled Jamal Mian, The Life of Maulana Jamaluddin Abdul Wahab of Farangi, Mahall, which is authored by Francis Robinson. In this session, we have Mahmood, Jamal, and Hameed Haroon in conversation with the author Francis Robinson, and the moderator for this session is Bari Mian. At the end of the discussion, we will have a Q&A session. I request all of you to please refrain from making statements and keep your questions as precise as possible. When the session is over, please don't stand near or on the stage because we have back-to-back sessions and doing so would create disturbance. A short introduction about Bari Mian now. Bari Mian Farangi Mahali is a well-known scholar and social figure. He is president of the Hasrat Mohani Memorial Society and has been an active member of Karachi's literary and art scenes. Over to you, Bari Mian. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd like to start by thanking everybody who's here. Especially, there's one person here who probably knew my father more than anyone else, including us, and that's Begum Pasha Haroon, wife of Mr. Yusuf Haroon. I welcome her. And it feels a bit surreal to be talking about my father, but Professor Robinson has done such a great work that we feel involved in it. And I'd like to quote a share which Mr. Professor Robinson has used in the book, and which I think illustrates my father's movement back and forth between Lucknow and Pakistan. And this was, we were traveling together. We were traveling together from Calcutta to Lucknow, and when the plane was about to descend, he read a share of Ghalib, which at that time I had no idea what he was talking about. Dil phir tawaaf-e kuए malamat ko jaye hai, pindar ka sanam kada veera kiye hue, karta hoon jama phir jigare lakht lakht ko, arsa hua hai daawat-e mijga kiye hue. And I, of course, did not know what he was talking about at that time, but much later I realized what must have been going through his mind. And I don't want to take much of your time. I only want to say that Professor Robinson has worked, how do I say, very hard on the subject he has chosen, and which he has informed me, and I'm sure my family, a lot of things we didn't know about. So without much ado, I'll pass you on to Mr. Hameed Haroon, who will then be in discussion with Mahmood Jamal, my brother, who assisted Dr. Robinson in the translations and other things that are present in the book. Over to you, Hameed Haroon.
No, Bari, it's over to Francis Robinson because he's going to show.
Mr. Francis Robinson, the chair is yours.
Thank you very much. Now, have we got picture 2 up? Just respond as I say the number. So this picture should be of Maulana Jamal. Picture 2. There we are. That's picture 1. So picture 2. Great, good. Thank you very much indeed. This book relates to the life of Jamal Mian, a remarkable product of the Farangi family of learned and holy men of Lucknow. The family entered India under Delhi Sultan, became established in Awadh in the mid-16th century, and in the 1690s was established by the Emperor Aurangzeb in Lucknow. In the 18th century, the family became South Asia's leading family of Islamic learning. In the early 20th century, under the leadership of Jamal Mian's father, Abdul, it became particularly active in Muslim politics. The book tells of Jamal Mian's upbringing in Farangi. A chapter explores his education in Madrasa Nizami, 3. What you see behind me is the entrance to the house of Mullah Nizamuddin in Farangi Mahall, and this is where the madrasa was, where Jamal Mian studied. Another chapter sets out the family's devotional year. Mian in Ramadan, Yabi in every month, attendance at the Urus in the family park, at Dancership, at Regalia and Ultimate, and so on. This laid the pattern for Jamal Mian's pious practice for the rest of his life. 4. This shows the bar. This is actually the tomb of Abdul Bari in the bar of the Wahab in Lucknow. The book also makes clear how, in his young life, Jamal Mian was surrounded by politicians from the Ali brothers to Gandhi, to Khalid-Uzzaman, to Jawaharlal. Indeed, in 1936, Shaukat Ali took Jamal Mian with him to attend the big conference on Palestine in Calcutta. And in the same year, Jawaharlal took him by the hand to get him to join him on the platform of the Lucknow Congress session. 5. This shows Gandhi's room in the Mahall in Farangi. You'll notice a little sapling outside it. That's in commemoration of the pawpaw tree to which Gandhi would tie his goat. From 1937 to 1947, Jamal Mian was fully involved, together with his friend Mahmood, in Muslim politics. He made his first appearance at the League meeting in Lucknow in 1937, where, despite Jinnah's disapproval, the 17-year-old made a speech. In 1937 and 1938, he was involved in lead campaigns in UP, Bombay, Sindh, and the Northwest Frontier province. 6. Here you see Jamal Mian, right in the center of the picture, leading on to Chaudhry Khalid-Uzzaman, who was led a deputation to the Northwest Frontier. 7. Here you see Jamal campaigning at Jacobabad in Sindh, and Jamal Mian is on the far end of the second row. By this time, Jamal was pleased to have this young Ali who could speak for the League. In 1942, he toured India to explain the Lahore Resolution. 8. Here we have Jamal Mian with the Raja of Mahmood. They did a lot of touring together, campaigning in Hyderabad. In 1943, he was made Honorary Assistant Secretary of the Muslim League. In 1945-46, he was fully involved in the great election campaigns which brought the Muslim League a strong position in the endgame of empire. He was himself elected to the UP Assembly, where his oratory made a big impact. In 1947, he was a member of the Indian, but in effect it was a Muslim League, trade delegation to the Middle East. 9. Here we have the trade delegation. They were lent a plane by the Turkish government to fly around the Middle East. And 10. Here we have Jamal Mian, young man, addressing the girls' school. And he says in his diaries, the girls, they just love to hear me speak. Throughout the period, he was able to support his family and the family madrasa by developing, under the patronage of the great Calcutta business firm of M.M. Isfahani, a tea business. And here you have a picture of Mirza Ahmed Isfahani, the creator of the Isfahani Empire. Jamal Mian did not migrate to Pakistan at partition. He stayed in Lucknow, where he had many commitments, among them his family, his business, the Farangi Madrasa, and his seat in the UP Assembly. But he quickly discovered that the atmosphere had become very unfavorable to Muslims of his time. The Congress government was passing law after law against their interests. He could no longer make a success of his business selling Isfahani labelled tea. The annexation of Hyderabad put an end to the state's important support for the Farangi Mahall madrasa. So, in 1950, Jamal Mian went to Dhaka, where the Isfahanis promised to help him revive his business. Well, here you see Jamal Mian in Dhaka. He's on the far left of the picture, with Mahmood on the far right, who's clearly just cracked a joke, with Ghulam Farooq, you remember, and with Mirza Ahmed Isfahani. In the center of the picture is a member of an Iraqi delegation. From 1950 to 1957, Jamal Mian lived between Dhaka and Lucknow. Soon he built a house in Dhaka, but he operated as though partition had never happened, travelling frequently to England. He maintained the annual devotional run he followed as a child. He continued to circulate amongst the elite of both countries. He might have breakfast with Pakistan's president, Iskandar Mirza, and then tea later in the day with the Indian Prime Minister, Jamal. When in Delhi, he always stayed with Rafi Ahmed Kitwal, the Indian cabinet minister. It was not surprising that elements in the Indian administration decided he was a star. In 1957, the High Commissioner in Dhaka impounded his passport. He was instructed to go to Delhi to explain himself. At this moment, his mother was dying in Lucknow. The only way he could see her and be reasonably sure that he would be able to return to Dhaka was by taking a Pakistani passport and therefore becoming a Pakistani citizen, and then getting a visa to visit India. From 1957 to 71, Jamal Mian was based in Dhaka. There he continued to develop his business with the support of the Isfahanis. He continued to raise money for the Farangi Mahall madrasa. In this regard, relations with the Dawoodi warriors became important. He also began to develop the international Islamic connections, which became a feature of the rest of his life. He became Pakistan's representative, both on the Saudi World Muslim League and on the Palestinian World Muslim Congress. The Mufti of Jerusalem, Haji Amin al-Husseini, whom Jamal Mian had known since the 1930s, became a close friend. 13. Here we have a picture of Jamal Mian with Haji Ahmed, Hameed, and you can see how affectionate the relationship is. At the same time, he declared a toast to people in the Pakistani administration, the Nawab Pahlawan, Mohammed Shuaib, his son married his daughter, and in particular, Ayub Khan. Jamal Mian's diaries record the ups and downs of their relationship. It was at its best when Jamal Mian was electioneering for him in 1965, 14. Here you see, it's not a very clear picture, but you've got a clear representation both of Ayub and of Jamal Mian. During the election campaign, Jamal Mian was staying with the Raja of Mahmood in 2 Primrose Road in the city. The two would have breakfast together. And then the Raja would go out to campaign for Fatima Jinnah and Jamal for Ali Khan. Jamal Mian's connections with the regime brought him one good thing, a license to develop a sugar. Now, Jamal Mian knew nothing about sugar, but with help, it was possible to develop it to a stage when he was able to sell off his Shakagan sugar mill project to Mian Bashir of the Chinioti Shell. The deal was done in 1970, and it meant that just at the moment when Jamal Mian lost almost all his property in Dhaka in the emergence of Bangladesh, he had the resources to build his life again in Karachi. From 1971 to his death in 2012, Jamal Mian lived an active retirement in Karachi. He was a regular attender at the meetings of World Muslim League in the Hijaz. He went on several delegations and fact-finding missions on behalf of both the World Muslim League and the World Muslim Congress. He supported the activities of Hakim Saeed's Hamdard Foundation. 15. He maintained his spiritual and literary pursuits, which he shared with a circle of friends and tells us about in great detail in his diary. He was a figure in Karachi society, performing many missions. All the time, he observed politics from a distance, offering the odd comment in his diary. Every year, he went to London, where several of his children settled. Several themes run through Jamal Mian's life. His concern to work for the best interests of Muslims as he saw it. This was why he worked for the All India Muslim League. Secondly, his dislike of those in public life who feathered their own nests while others were poorer and suffering. This was the reason for his great attack on the Congress ministry in the UP Assembly in 1946, when in its very first measure was to raise the salaries of ministers. This was the reason why, in December 1947, at the very last meeting of the Muslim League Council in this city, he attacked a resolution calling Pakistan a Muslim state. He did so because the new country's ministers were not living like those of Muslim states of the past. They were living like princes, while millions of refugees around them lived poverty. Thirdly, he was opposed to the development of Pakistan as an Islamic state. This was a message he gave to the Constituent Assembly. It was a message he gave to Ayub Khan's Constitutional Commission. It was also his response to Bhutto's constitutional reforms. He objected to any arrangements which penalized Pakistan's non-Muslim minorities. He had a joke about the objectives resolution, which had created an opening Islamization. The Qaradar-e-Mufassir, he said, ought to be called the Qaradar-e-Mufassir. The disorder resolution. For Jamal Mian's Sufi faith remained constant throughout his life, but its focus was eventually transformed by partition. For most of his life, his main focus was on the saints of Farangi Mahall, Vansar Sharif, Gurgaon Sharif, and Ajmer Sharif. But eventually, the realities of partition made this loyalty hard to sustain. In 1982, going to Ajmer and Lucknow made him so ill that he swore never to go to India again. From then on, he turned his attention to Abdul the descendant of Ghaus Azam, who is buried in the city, and of course, to the Prophet's tomb in Medina. This slow reorienting of his spiritual focus from India to Pakistan and the Hijaz is another example of what the scholar Wazir Zamindar has called the long partition. Jamal Mian had the gift of friendship, and this book of his life is a testament to his friendships. There was Hazrat Mahmood, the poet and politician, through whose diaries we see Jamal Mian in the years after independence. Jamal Mian, some of you know, worked hard to sustain his memory in this city, publishing his collected poems and establishing his annual day of celebration on the 13th of May. 16. There was the Raja Amir Ahmad Khan of Mahmood, who at times maintained a delightful correspondence with Jamal Mian, and who was close to him from the Lucknow Muslim League meeting of 1937 to the Raja's death in 1973. 17. And here you have this remarkable photograph of the two men together, very much men about town with modern cameras. There was Sayyid Ismail, also known as Mirza Mehdi, Isfahani, the son of Mirza Ahmed Isfahani, who created the Isfahani business empire. As a young man, he had a very intense relationship with Jamal Mian, which became a lifetime of supportive friendship. Jamal Mian called him his closest friend and felt his family owed much to him. 18, he received the two men together, probably in Dhaka in the 1960s. There was Dr. Farangi, a close Lucknow friend from the 1940s, who accompanied Jamal Mian to the inauguration of Pakistan in this city in August 1947, and who was to become a leader of the UP Muslims in the 1960s. There was Mahmood, Ayub Khan's finance minister, who went on to serve at the World Bank. In the 1960s, he and Jamal Mian sustained a lively correspondence. There was Haji Amina Hussain. There is no extant correspondence to tell us about this relationship, but Jamal Mian's diary leaves us in no doubt about how he felt about Haji Hameed, as to some of the remarkable photographs we have of the two together. 19. Again. The book tells us of other friendships, but these particular friendships stand out. The final thing is that Jamal Mian was the epitome of Lucknow culture. A man who read widely, as his library tells us, in Arabic, Persian, Urdu, and English, and commanded a great range of poetry. The book analyzes his library and his annotations of text. It was this high level of cultivation, alongside his personal qualities, which enabled him to attract his circle other gifted people in Lucknow, Dhaka, and Karachi. It goes some way towards explaining his success. Nothing. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Robinson. I think Hameed, Haroon, your...
Bari, I'd like to...
Some initial remarks. Firstly, it's a major
कुछ नहीं
बंद हो गया
बंद हो गया
बंद हो गया कुछ नहीं हेलो हेलो नेगेटिव
Okay.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the session. Something that Bari Mian should have said but didn't say. I did. It's actually a major event. Not because Bari Mian, Mahmood and me are here, but because Dr. Francis Robinson is here. And I'd like to dwell on that event, but first of all, I'd like to welcome three different groups of people. The first, Mrs. Vahidi, who's here, and in her long life, her career as an educationist and as a scholar at home, she contains within her all the refinements of the Indo-Persian plant of culture that Francis Robinson has written so lovingly about. Secondly, the children of Jamal Mian Farangi Mahall, who have flown in along with members of his family from all parts of the world to hear Dr. Francis Robinson speak about Jamal Mian. And finally, my aunt Pasha Yusuf Haroon, who I envy because she is perhaps the only witness here who in 1938 saw Maulana Jamal Mian Farangi Mahal confidently stride into the doors of Seafield when Abdullah Haroon was alive for the Karachi Muslim League 1938 conference, where he had, on one side, he had Raja Sahab Mahmoodabad, and on the other side, Yusuf Haroon. The trio were frequently referred to by Mr. Jinnah and some of the more acerbic league commentators as the Young Turks, in deference to Ataturk's revolutionary escapades 20 years before, and they were considered to be a kind of young vanguard to move the idea of Pakistan forward. So after having noted that, I'd like to preface my remarks by telling you that before I ask a question, everything I am speaking about is inferred and available in Francis Robinson's books. Now, Francis Robinson is not an ordinary historian. I can't commentate about world academic circles, although he's much respected. I can say for South Asia, he is vital for us. He's vital for you young people. He's vital for you young people who are here today to hear about Jamal Mian and Francis Robinson's work without quite knowing why exactly. We are all in that same position for many years. Well, I'll tell you why exactly. Francis Robinson is like Farmer Oak in Thomas Hardy's novel, who didn't know he spoke prose all his life. Francis Robinson is today here as, rather ironically, as the transmitter of that tradition which has died for us, which we have ignored, which has been usurped. Its position has been usurped by other kinds of historiography, by other schools of ulama, and the plant of the Persian Indian tradition, which produced such a great flowering of literature, of theology, of commentaries, of so many things which we admire and which are not there in Pakistan today. This plant has been forcibly wrenched out like a weed and removed from our culture. Young people sitting up here, and there are many, speak about their devotion to rescuing heritage. Well, all heritage is not material culture. It is the culture of the mind, of the spirit. This is the work that Francis Robinson has done. He has rescued from obscurity in this country a tradition, a live tradition that dominated the 18th century vision of Islam in South Asia, and that created what we would call liberal, but I think would be flexible, rational bases for Muslims practicing and thinking about things in South Asia today. Why do I say this plant has been usurped? Because we all know that as a result of the creation of Pakistan, the culture of the core, which had dominated Muslim rule for several hundred years in India, became divorced from the culture of the periphery. Side by side, as Robinson will tell you, there are two volumes that I would strongly refer to. The second is the Jamal Mian book that Francis Robinson has written today. The first is the Ulama of Farangi Mahall, which was published by Feroz Sons in 2001 and is a landmark piece of work along with this book. I suggest you buy these books, you take them home to your family, you read them, you try to retrieve from there, through Francis Robinson's work and scholarly documentation, the world that has been lost to us in Pakistan today. What is this world that has been lost to us? Well, Robinson speaks very, very adequately about the two traditions that came into conflict over Islamic rule in India and as the Mughal power declined. The first of these rules, the first of these ways of thinking was incorporated in madrasa syllabi as mankulat, which had its emphasis on the transmitted sciences, on hadith, on fiqh, and on tafsir. The second that Robinson speaks about is the makulat tradition. And here he links it to the spiritual traditions alive in Awadh in the 17th and 18th centuries, which flowered and were to decline as the 19th century progressed. Maulana Abdul Bari of Farangi Mahall, Jamal Mia's father, being the last of those people. And he discusses the conflict that emerged between the Delhi school, where you had mankulat stressed, where the transmitted sciences, where the hadith and theology remained everything. Shah Waliullah and his sons, and of course Sayyid Ahmad al-Rai Bareilly and others belong to that tradition, which stemmed from a long-standing Naqshbandi tradition. On the other hand, he speaks in detail about the tradition of the rational sciences. Farangi Mahal was part of that tradition of the rational sciences. He speaks about Shirazi in the reign of the Emperor Akbar and people who followed him. He speaks about the early Farangi Mahallis in Lucknow and about the tradition and how it consummated into the Dars-e-Nizamiya syllabus, which became the basis for rational sciences. Today, when you look at lost heritage in Pakistan, this rational sciences, this mankulat in the madrasa syllabus that Robinson has spoken so eloquently about, is what we have lost. We have become automatons, doing exactly the opposite of what the Dars-e-Nizamiya syllabus said. We learn by rote, we accept authority, we look at Muslim reformism, which was only a movement which grew out of Naqshbandiyism. In fact, some would call it a Protestantism in this tradition. We look at that and we apply it to those people who tell us how we should think, how we should interpret Islam, and how we should believe in our own religion and transmit it in various ways. So when Francis Robinson comes here, for the young people in this country, this is a message. Retrieve that tradition. I call him a transmitter because his book so eloquently describes, draws in that tradition, analyzes it, and gives it monographic form. Jamal Mian, Maulana Jamal Mian, who I love greatly, was the last great transmitter of that tradition we know. In his life, he lived it as a result of circumstances in the 20th century, which Robinson eloquently describes, how through the movement for Pakistan, there were two traditions, as Robinson points out, in Farangi Mahall amongst the ulama there. One was the activist tradition, which I think Mullah Haider and others had, who had been involved in the Awadh uprising in 1857, demonstrated. The other was the scholarly tradition and the inflection, the inward-looking one. I think that short of a few brief years, like his father, Jamal Mia's tradition, in that brief period that he was in the forefront of the Muslim League and close to Jinnah, to Liaquat, to all the leaders, I won't go into that, but I will say that that tradition was only part of it. The rest of his life, he looked into himself. He was a scholar and a teacher. He had seen his home taken away from him. He had lived in Dhaka. He had seen that home taken away from him. He came to Karachi. He was a perpetual hermit, yet he maintained sanity. He maintained his peace of mind. He was critical of what the people, the politicians in Pakistan were doing as early as the Objectives Resolution. He had a very strong moral point, which nobody makes anymore, that the Pakistan Jinnah and Muslim League fought for. They promised equality to all citizens, and yet the Objective Resolution, no criticism of Liaquat, it was the climate, was taking you towards a situation where those equal rights were no longer possible. In Maulana Jamal Mia's tradition, in the Mankulat tradition, which fell back on the Wahdatul Wujud as opposed to the Wahdatul Shudud, in the other tradition of Shah Waliullah and the Mankulat school, you have this ability to exclude. The Wahdatul Shudud spoke about the oneness of conception, and therefore like-minded, a kind of narrow straitjacket Calvinism was the order of the day. The Wahdatul Wujud spoke about the Sufic inclusiveness of all God's creation, of loving all of God's creation. Jamal Mian and his family thrived under, in the 18th and 19th centuries, partly in the 18th and certainly in part of the 19th, under a Shia-led Hukamran in Awadh, not a Sunni one. Jamal Mian was a Sunni, and yet his contribution, his tradition's contribution, is something that Francis Robinson has come here to speak about today. And everything I have said, whether rightly or wrongfully, and the wrongs are not attributed to Francis Robinson, is taken from his book, his words. I'm paraphrasing them. Thank you, Francis Robinson, for helping us rescue an important piece of heritage of our minds so we can stand up as educated people and not as illiterates and participate in the great debate which is overtaking Pakistan today, rather one-sidedly. So my first question to you is, could you speak about the clash of these two traditions and also the inroads made by the reformists and Western education in the stature of Farangi Mahalli style madrasa education and how that changed things in the 20s?
Of course. Well, you said most of it already. That's it.
But you say it so much better, Francis.
Well, inshallah. Hameed Saab is absolutely right to say that in Farangi Mahal, the rationalist and the transmitted traditions were well balanced. And it was part of the Farangi Mahalli tradition to maintain that strong sense of balance between what was revealed and the skills that you needed in order to make what was revealed work in society at large. One thing always to remember about the Darsi-Nizami, which Hameed Saab has just mentioned, is that it's not a particular prescription of books, which is what many people think it to be. It is actually a method of teaching. And that method of teaching is designed to enable students to get through the books as quickly and as effectively as possible. And that's one reason why the Darsi-Nizami was so effective in the 18th and 19th centuries, because it enabled people to complete the course and probably get a job in government service by the time they were 18 or 17 or 18. And do remember that the Darsi-Nizami was not necessarily concerned just to produce people who were religious in that sense. It was concerned to produce people who would be effective government administrators, who might also be effective in running a business. It's only more recently that the Darsi-Nizami has turned into something that might be associated with, in inverted commas, religious education. The second thing that Hameed Saab has mentioned, and which is a source of great sadness, and that is the great decline of the Persianate traditions in India from the 19th century to the present. There's a very good reason why they declined, and that was because they were essentially sustained by the Mughal Empire. And once the Mughal Empire was no longer in full force, it became harder and harder to sustain this Persianate forms of knowledge. And in this context, on the one hand, the old Persianate forms of knowledge were challenged, as Hameed Saab has told us, by forms of Islamic revival, the ideas of Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahab, the ideas of Shah Waliullah, which have produced a long strand of reform that has continued to work its way through your society up to the present. That began to constrain the area in which the Persianate forms of knowledge could flourish. The other was the emergence of Western knowledge, patronized by the British, which ambitious young people knew they had to follow if they were going to have positions of power and to have positions of wealth. So there are very good historical reasons for why Persianate knowledge has actually been increasingly in a vice created by the forces of history. But you know all of that.
I think, Francis, it's important for people here who've come to hear you to know something about it, because the first thing you mentioned, two particular incidents which create the stage exit of the Persian language. And the Persian language, as you point out in your volume, is not some court language, but is a language prevalent with large urban numbers of scholars, of ulama, and even in the Hindu-ruled courts of India and South India, that language was being used. You speak about how the British legislated the removal of the Persian language from the upper judiciary and from the lower courts, where English and regional languages were then substituted. And then in 1947, I think, if I've got it right, in the UP legislature, you speak about how under the secular Congress rule, Persian verses were removed from the walls of the UP Assembly. And you describe these roughly these 115 or 120 years, these are the most significant death blows for the killing of the Indo-Persian plant.
Well, you very rightly refer to the fact that Persian was a language of government, not just for the Mughals, but for many Hindu regimes as well. And in fact, many of the civil servants who operated amongst the Mughals were Hindus, usually Kayasths, sometimes Khatris, sometimes Kashmiri Brahmins. And in fact, there's a marvelous book published quite recently by a man called Sinra, who's a pupil of Muzaffar Alam at the University of Chicago, which reveals the whole world of this highly passionate Hindu munshi who is right at the center of government under Shah Jahan and then subsequently under the young Aurangzeb. So you're right to emphasize the fact that it's not just Muslims who sustain this Persianate tradition, but also Hindus. But that said, it is still a creature of the Mughal Empire and of Mughal power. And once Mughal power goes and the British come in, it's very difficult to sustain it outside special environments like Hyderabad, Deccan.
Francis, I'd like to ask you one particular question about this Indo-Persian plant, because as you mention in your book very clearly, Urdu contained within it all those elements, like Hindi did as well, of words from various languages which the conquerors had brought with them to South Asia. And when Urdu was banned after 1947 as the language of instruction in schools in the UP, and Hindi was introduced, this was a time when Jamal Mian was going through one of the worst crises of his life, the post-partition scenario for those Muslims who had been in the forefront of the Muslim League and had stayed behind to watch their participation in society being dismantled, which led Jamal Mian to go to Dhaka. Could you speak about those years, because you do so beautifully in the book?
Well, absolutely. As I'm sure most of you know, the years 47 to 51, 52 were absolute hell for Muslims in India. And this comes through. One of the points where it comes through most clearly is in the diary, a very detailed diary, which Hazrat Mahani keeps from 1947 through to 51. Amongst his many positions is as a local councillor in Kanpur. And he tells you almost day by day the horrible things that are happening to local traders, the way in which people are being dragged off to prison, the way in which people are being discriminated against in all kinds of ways. So there is the advantage of having access to that rather special diary. But at just one point where I will differ from Hameed Saab, Urdu wasn't banned in schools in the UP in the 1940s, but it was made much harder to pursue Urdu in schools. And it was made much harder, for instance, for Urdu school teachers to get jobs. One of the things that happens to Hazrat Mani is constantly having deputations of Urdu school teachers who no longer are able to find jobs. But Urdu is still being taught. Nevertheless, there is that dramatic moment when Hazrat Mahani enters the UP Legislative Assembly chamber, which had always had great pieces of verse in Nastaliq on its walls. And he comes in and he sees that these have all been ripped out by the Congress government. And of course, it's a very graphic demonstration of how the world has changed.
Francis, I see this session as an examination of the Farangi Mahali tradition of Maulana Jamal Mian, but also of Francis Robinson, the historian, the raconteur of the tradition. And I would like to ask Mahmood, you worked with Francis Robinson while he was doing this book. You worked with the primary sources and you worked, you helped him translate as well. What can you say about Francis Robinson's technique as a historian. He's such a major figure for us, and if any light you can throw on him writing this book and the materials he used will give us a further insight into understanding Francis Robinson, the man. I hope we don't have an ulama protest coming from the back.
I don't know where this music is coming from, but
It's heavenly. It's a Deobandi music.
I don't know if you can hear me. Hello?
इनको जरा ऊंचा करें यार. Bring it closer to you, Mahmood. Bring it closer.
I've got it close.
Yeah, that's fine.
Well, I've been working on this project with Professor Robinson for the last at least 7 years, I would say. And
यार उनको कहो कम करेंगे क्या हो रहा है?
obviously, the problem
I think
is,
it's an organized protest by a different sect of thinkers. Yeah, they've got on to you, Abudi.
but anyway, for me it's been a great pleasure because I've learned so many things, not only about my own father and family background, but also about the techniques that accomplished historian uses to get his evidence. And with with Professor Robinson, one of the great things I learned is obviously his whole scientific method of collecting information. And then of course, what he selects to use is obviously based on what he has in mind. But what I learned was that everything has to be evidenced in some way. You just don't say things just because you heard them from somebody. You know, it's not just oral history, but it must have a specific location and a place and a time.
I'm going to ask you a difficult question, Mahmood. Did you and Bari Mian give to Francis Robinson all the papers pertaining to Jamal Mian, or did you hold something back? Because Jamal Mian was a very private man. I don't know how far he would like to have shared some of the controversial views he lived with in the later years of his life.
No, of course. There are, you know, when you're looking at somebody's diaries, which are not essentially always political diaries, if a politician writes his diary, he writes it in a certain way. And these diaries have some very personal, not just views on politics, but on personal life. Obviously, you have to distinguish how much you can reveal and how much he would want to reveal. And I had to play the fact that we had to discuss whether my father wrote it for public knowledge or for private consumption, you know. So this is always the case.
You sound like Andy Warhol's estate. I'd like to ask Francis a question about this, Francis. Could you tell us about your subject? Why did you choose Jamal Mian? And tell us about your earliest encounter with him, that wonderful anecdote about your wife's meeting with him. You said something about him.
Okay. Really, I think it's a bit of both, really. I both chose the Farangi Mahallis, and then they subsequently chose me. When I first started doing research...
Well, you're being modest, Francis, because your book on the separatism amongst Indian Muslims in UP is one of the most important books lying in his library, which he always loved, and he wanted to meet you, so you're being a little modest.
Yeah, but I was going to explain how we came to deal with the Farangi Mahallis in the context of separatism. And when I started doing research in 1967, I quickly discovered, I was a very, very green person at that time, that people called ulama were quite important. If you were thinking of northern India at the beginning of the 20th century, and actually a family called the Farangi Mahallis were very important, and indeed a man called Abdul Bari was extremely important. So when I set out to do research in India in 1968, or 67, 68, I set out to engage with Farangi Mahal at the earliest possible moment. And when I did that, some materials were made available to me, which were extremely, extremely useful in my first book. As a result of that first book, Jamal Mian, when he came to London in 1976, asked to see me. And he wanted to put me right on one or two things. I won't say what they were. But we got on extremely well. In fact, the meeting must have gone on for 5 or 6 hours. At the end of that, he said, you know, I've got all my papers in Karachi now. I didn't know they just arrived. I've got all my papers in Karachi, and you're welcome to come and see them whenever you want. I went as soon as I could to do that, and in the winter of 1976 and the beginning of 1977, Jamal Mian began the business of showing me the great riches that he had in the family archives. And what I realized was that this was one of the most remarkable collections of papers relating to any family you were likely to discover in any country in the world. They started with some of Akbar's first known Farmans in the mid-17th century and came right down to the present. So there was, in this archive, the opportunity to engage with the Farangi Mahall family in depth, which I then began to do. And the importance of this was it enabled me to understand the process of the transmission of Islamic learning from within. It enabled me to understand a major learned and holy family from within. And this understanding has influenced all the work I've done ever since. Everything from my major Atlas of the Islamic World since 1500, which is completely built around the process of the transmission of Islamic knowledge. In a sense, what I learned and what I demonstrated in that atlas and other works is that the central theme of Islamic history is the transmission of Islamic knowledge through time, that is the transmission of the formal knowledge of Islam and the spiritual knowledge of Islam, and the interactions of the transmitters, on the one hand, with the wielders of power, and on the other hand, with society at large. And I've endeavored to try and get this way of writing Islamic history established, for instance, when we talked about how we might create a new Cambridge history of Islam about 15 years ago. I pitched the idea that, in fact, the whole history ought to be built around this. In fact, I couldn't persuade others. I was only able to persuade those who contributed to my own volume to do that. But the point is that my interaction with Jamal Mian and his family have actually produced a whole way of writing Islamic history and engaging with the Muslim world.
Francis, I want to divert you and ask you about something which is a very important part of your book. Your last chapter on Jamal Mian speaks in profuse detail, as everybody is aware, that examination of libraries of people is one way of understanding their world, their universe, although Francis did point out that the Persian books that he had recourse to in Lucknow were not available in his own library. But could you tell us something about that library and how it reflects Jamal Mian's personality?
Yes, thank you very much, Hameed. The library, about 2,000 books, in 4 languages: Arabic, Urdu, Persian, and English. You have, I think, much of the kind of learning and poetry that you'd expect a man of his cultivation in Urdu and Persian to enjoy. But what would be striking for many people is the range of books in the English language that he has. He's a man who loves Dickens, and indeed has read all of Dickens. He's a man who likes Oscar Wilde. Now, Oscar Wilde might seem a little risque for a Maulana, but no, he loves Oscar Wilde. Bernard Shaw is another great figure for him. Equally, Sherlock Holmes, great reader. In fact, the way in which he tried to cope with the Israeli bombardment of Beirut in 1982 was by constantly reading the complete Sherlock Holmes. This was the only way he could take his mind off that terrible event. So we had a man of very broad intellectual and cultural sympathies. And to give you some idea of the breadth, and I don't know how much you know about sort of English comedies, but he also greatly enjoyed a BBC comedy called,
Dad's Army.
Dad's Army, that's right. And would take box sets from London back to Karachi to enjoy them. So, in a sense, his sense of humour stretched to embrace an English sense of humour as well. There is one other thing that I'd like to mention, which I think it says a great deal about the man. At one moment, he notes in his diary that he's very cross that his youngest son, Mian, is appearing on television playing a guitar. And he says that's not the kind of thing that people of our background should be doing. And then immediately in the next line, he criticizes himself very powerfully and saying, that's a very snobbish comment. I should never have made it.
There's one last aspect I'd like to ask. Bari, I know the time is running out. We haven't spoken of one aspect of Jamal Mian. I want Francis to say something brief about it, the Sufic part of his life, and how important it was to be a Sufi. And then, Bari, I'll ask you one question after that, if I may, because I need that to cover all the boxes I've checked out in my mind. Sorry, Francis.
We are running out of time. I think they have a question and answer
It's
session.
4:25 and we'll release it at 4:30 as we were asked to.
No, but they need to have a question.
2 quick minutes. 2 to you and 2 to Francis.
No, I don't need you, Mr. Doctor.
So, do you want me to comment?
I want to comment on the Sufic part of Jamal Mian's life and his Sufism and the Sufi link with Farangi Mahall.
Well, the Sufi element of his life is absolutely central, very important. It is really bred into him right from the beginning of his life. And so his life is actually measured, or each year is measured by attendance at particular urs. And when he went to Dhaka, he endeavored to sustain the devotional round that he'd learned in Lucknow. And when he came to Karachi, he continued to try to sustain that devotional round. But the great sadness was that it became increasingly difficult to sustain the old Sufi devotional round when he was based in Karachi. And the whole business of coming to India became more and more of a strain. It reminded him of the terrible things, or the wonderful things in many ways, that he had lost. It reminded him of the great family tradition that he was no longer himself able to play a major role in sustaining. And so his Sufi focus moves from the old shrines in India towards that of Abdul Qadir Jilani in Karachi, and then subsequently and very powerfully towards Medina.
Okay, Dr. Robinson, I'd like to thank
I'm going to conclude with some verses which Jamal Mian liked and say a little about his love for poetry, and then we're through. As the epilogue, Bari Mian.
Oh my God.
And clearly, Bari Mian, please. As the scholar gypsy of the clan.
I don't know where to begin. I'll let Mahmood do that. And he wants a... Mahmood, let us get the question and answer session, and when I'm closing it, I'll do that.
Okay, sure.
If there's anybody has any question to anyone, Professor Robinson or anybody, with that, Dr. Nasir.
Thank you. Indeed, a remarkable story of a very remarkable man, Professor Robinson. Many of us are fortunate to have known Maulana Jamal Mian and know his family. My question to you is that you must have interviewed him many times, and for a man who got displaced from Lucknow to Dhaka, Dhaka to Karachi, and Was there ever a sense of disappointment, despair, or even sadness, the way events have taken us today where we are? I mean, he saw a lot of changes, and what Pakistan in his last few days, or last few years of his life, is very different from what he must have envisioned it to be.
Thank you. I think the answer is no. There was no great element of despair. And here I'm really talking about the evidence one can get from his diary, in which he communicates his most personal thoughts. And there's not despair. Almost invariably he's looking forwards. And of course, for much of his life, he's concerned about how he can look after his family. So his approach is one of pragmatism and of being positive, although he had many, many good reasons for despairing.
Please. Excuse me, Mr. Francis Robinson, for my very personal question to you. How much you have been influenced by Islam as a religion yourself?
Very, very interesting question. I would say, in one sense, no, because I'm an unrepentant, deeply secular person, influenced probably most powerfully by the traditions of the Church of England. On the other hand, the many months and years of my time that I've spent with Muslims and in Muslim societies has given me a respect for faith that I have never, I think, unlikely to have developed in the context of Britain in the 20th century. So I've certainly been influenced by the examples of many of the Muslims with whom I've moved.
I think it's time for one more question.
Assalamu alaikum and hi. My name is Sumbul, and I would love for you to tell me why Jamaluddin was campaigning for Ayub Khan in opposition to Fatma Jinnah. And I'm sorry, I haven't read the book.
I'm sorry, my hearing isn't brilliant.
Could you just elaborate on why he campaigned for Ayub Khan in opposition to Fatma Jinnah?
Why he operated with Ayub Khan. I think up until 1965, Jamal Mian was really impressed by Ayub Khan's modernizing project. So he thought that that was probably the way we should be going. Now, you may want to raise questions about, well, what about democracy and why should Jamal Mian perhaps ignore that? But Jamal Mian, in his own writing, does raise that with himself and takes the line that actually what Pakistan needs in the early 60s is that kind of modernization that Ayub Khan was bringing. By 1965, and certainly after the 1965 war, the two are beginning to divide quite substantially. And Jamal Mian says, as in his diary, I don't think Ayub Khan likes me anymore. He sees me as a Hindustani and not a Pakistani, and so that's a problem.
Francis, there's this wonderful line in your book where you describe that while living at 2 Framrose Road, which is Raja Mahmoodabad's residence, Jamal Mian used to go out every morning campaigning for Ayub Khan in 1964 and 65, and Raja Mahmoodabad used to go out campaigning every morning for Fatma Jinnah. What the two of them said when they sat together at home in the evening is a matter for speculation.
Indeed.
Ladies and gentlemen, I think we have come to the end of the session. I would like to thank everybody for being here, especially Francis Robinson, Hameed, Haroon, and Mahmood Jamal. And I can only describe my father in a share of Allama Iqbal, where he says that because my father was actually a very universal man, even though he may have longed for a lot of things in Lucknow, he did not feel that he did not belong in Pakistan or elsewhere. पाक है गर्द वतन से सरे दाना तेरा, तू यूसुफ है कि हर मिस्र है कना तेरा. Thank you. Thank you very much.
I would request everyone to join me in standing up and lauding Professor Francis Robinson for his career spent in the pursuit of history and Farangi Mahal.
That's very kind of you. Thank you. Thank you.